Hi guys, welcome to the continuation of Archaeoplastida. Today we're going to finish up this group. As you can see, we've been hanging around here for the last couple of weeks. Last week we did Rhodophyta. Today we're going to do the green ones. But what I really want you to think about from now and until the rest of the course is don't just memorize a bunch of names and a bunch of life cycles. I want you to think about the survey of the protists as kind of the answer to the question, how many different ways are there to be a cell? Or how many different ways are there to be a eukaryote? There are seemingly unlimited ways you can organize a cell. These organisms are crazy. There's so many of them that are so bizarre, have such strange life cycles, and such strange body forms. It's wild. I mean, I'm going to show you a couple. But this is just a drop in the bucket. And protists traditionally have been really ignored in ecological research. So who knows what else is out there? These things are really crazy. Okay, so let's just ground ourselves. Where are we? We're talking about the archaeoplastids. We've talked about the red algae. Today we're going to talk about glaucophytes, green algae. And we're not going to talk about land plants. Next week, we're going to talk about land plants because even though they're not protists, these organisms are all share one evolutionary path. So they're the next solution, the different solution to how to be a eukaryote. Talk about that next week. Okay, so within the chlorophyta, so the green algae are the chlorophyta. There's three major lineages that we're going to look at: the Chlorophyceae, the Ovophyceae, and the Charophyceae. What do you need to know about this? Well, this is from your text, and I thought I'd do you the favor of telling you what I don't care about. I don't care about those two things. So what were they? Oops. Flagellar apparatus and photorespiratory enzymes. They're important, but not for the purpose of this class because it's a broad survey. So you can ignore those. The mitosis and cytokinesis are important, but we're not going to talk about them this week. We're going to come back to them next week when we talk about bryophytes. So you don't have to know them for this week. Next class. But what we're going to talk about is habitat and life history. That's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so what should you take away from this lecture? I want you to think about the adaptations of the different groups, what the changes were and why do you think they did it? You will never know for sure, but it's nice to think about. And then I want you to know the basic traits of these three groups, the chlorophytes, ovophytes, and charophyta. Now, the literature is mixed up on suffixes and prefixes, not prefixes, suffixes. So your textbook says Chlorophyceae, Ovophyceae, and Charophyceae. So I should use that consistently. Neither of them are wrong, it's just different classification systems. So what do you need to know about those three groups? You need to know what their life cycle looks like, whether or not they're uni or multicellular, because that's important, and what kind of habitat, broadly speaking. We're not going into fine detail here. Okay, but before we get started, I want to talk about something. I said you should know whether or not they're uni or multicellular, because that's really, multicellularity was a big innovation for these organisms. And tied to the evolution of multicellularity is the evolution of sex. And sex becomes more and more important the more multicellular you are. And so this is a tree of the eukaryotes showing you which groups are uni and multi or mixed. And so here we are up here, we are looking at the green algae, and it says some members are multicellular, some are unicellular. So this is a group that's kind of midway. Some groups have completely transitioned to multicellular, like land plants. There's no such thing as a singular cell land plants. But just want you to think about that, how these little changes, well, big changes, this multicellularity, affect the potential for all these other changes to occur. Okay, so chlorophyta, let's start with that one, or Chlorophyceae. These are both micro and macro algae, so they can be uni or multicellular, and there's a ton of them. They're mostly aquatic. If you live in are terrestrial, like they can live in tree barks, they can live in soil, they can live in snow. They kind of live all over the place. Now, the one your textbook talks about in most detail is Chlamydomonas. unicellular. It has 2 equal flagella, and it looks like a spore, but that's the entire organism. And this 2 equal flagella, that's a hallmark of this group. It's very diagnostic. What else should I say about Chlamydomonas? It's little, it's green. It has an eye spot, which helps it detect lights, right? Because it is got chloroplast, as you can see in this picture. But it also has something new that we haven't talked about yet. It has purinoids. Purinoids are these big splotches in the middle of the cell, in the chloroplast. They're inside the chloroplast, and they accumulate starch around them. What are they and what do they do? Well, purinoids, they're a solution to low carbon dioxide. If you live in the water, carbon dioxide doesn't diffuse very rapidly in water. And so these organisms, these photosynthetic organisms, are often limited in the amount of carbon they can fix because of this diffusion gradient. So the purinoid is a mechanism that these organisms use to concentrate CO2 in water. Basically, they pump in bicarbonate, calcium carbonate, which is abundant in water, and they transform it into CO2. And that is where most of the photosynthesis happens. It makes them extremely efficient photosynthesizers. And this only happens in green algae and some mosses. So it's not a universal trait because these are the organisms that spend most of their lives in water. It doesn't work for terrestrial organisms. So let's talk about life cycles now. I know you all love life cycles, I do too. Now I said at the very beginning of class, I said the evolution of multicellularity was key for the evolution of sex. So does that mean unicellular organisms can't have sex? Well, no, they do, and I'll show you, they can, but they're limited. They're very limited because their bodies become gametes, and that's all they've got. So they can't adapt to a wide range of conditions, and they're kind of vulnerable, right? They're in the environment just floating around. I mean, that's key. They have to float around. They have to be aquatic. Okay, so here's a really basic life cycle. You've got your diploid zygote, which is unicellular, undergoes meiosis, grows into haploid unicellular sporophytes, which then become gametes and fuse. Really simple. So this would be an example of where does meiosis happen? It happens in the zygote. This is a zygotic meiosis. Even though there's no multicellularity, this is still a form of zygotic meiosis. You know, these are better pictures, but it's exactly the same thing. We only ever have one cell, and the gametes fuse. They fuse and they produce a zygote. It's really simple. This is like one of the simplest life cycles on Earth, other than binary fission. Okay, it's very simple. Same terms. We've heard all these terms before. There's nothing new here. Now, I said there's unicellularity and there's multicellularity in this group, but there's also something kind of in between. There's quite a few examples of colonial unicellular organisms. So they're still unicellular, but they have the benefits of multicellularity without being multicellular. So these organisms look and behave like multicellular organisms, and yet they're not. So the one your textbook talks about the most is Volvox. Now, this is one of those organisms that is just like, wow, they are spectacular. They're so beautiful and so crazy. I mean, what we're looking at here are 3 colonies made up of thousands of individuals. So every little splotch of light is an individual, kind of looks like a Chlamydomonas, but they live in this coordinated, concerted colony where they coordinate their movements so that they can swim around. They coordinate their reproduction so that they can have sex. It is a wild, crazy organism. Now, before we show you more about that life cycle, I wanted to talk about how the evolution of sex is kind of apparent in this organism, Volvox, right? If we start with a early, like a Chlamydomonas-like ancestor that's free living, this is a really simple lifestyle, their gametes, they're isogamic. That means their gametes are the same size and the same shape. You can't tell the difference. There's no such thing as male and female. But as organisms get more complicated, gametes start to differentiate. And so here we have this anisogamy, is intermediate eudorina, and here where the egg cell is, they're both flagellate still. The egg cell is big and the sperm cell is smaller. So those are anisogamic, but eventually the egg cell loses its flagella and is sessile, and the only motile gamete is the sperm. And when we've got that, we've got oogamy, which is widely prevalent in animals and in plants and in some algae. So specialization, that's what the key is. Specialization of bodies can facilitate sexual reproduction. And we'll talk about the advantages of oogamy when we talk about bryophytes next week. Okay, so let's go back to Volvox. Sorry, too fast. So the colonies, those little bubbles, can be asexual or sexual. So they're coordinating, all the cells are working together. They're not just doing their own thing. The sexual colonies can be monoecious or dioecious. That is, they can produce male-only gametes or female-only gametes, or they can produce both. These green blotches in the middle of the colony, these are called gonidia. And gonidia are cells that differentiate, and they can either go on to produce gametes, egg and sperm cells, or they can reproduce vegetatively and create new vegetative cells and vegetative reproduction. Okay, so let's go through this. This is an example of vegetative reproduction. So let's say we have this mature colony that releases all these baby colonies from asexual reproduction. They grow and they grow, but here the gonidia, the gonidia, instead of just becoming new reproductive or vegetative cells, there's an environmental cue, and the gonidia, instead of becoming the chlamydomonas-like creature, they become gametes. And then the gametes are released and fertilization happens. Here, I'll show you that. So asexual male, asexual female, sexual inducer, environmental cues, they produce sperm, egg, and sperm packets. Remember, the sperm are motile. They swim to the ova in the female colony and produce zygotes. So it's pretty cool that it's so complicated, right? There's specialized cells, there's specialization of function. It's almost like they have organs, gamete, like organism or organs specialized for reproduction, but they're not organs, they're organisms. Every cell here is an individual. They're just coordinated. Okay, so that's an example of a motile colony. There's also non-motile colonies, which are equally complex. They talk a little bit about this one in your text. I'm not going to go into great detail, but these ones commonly form on surface blooms in aquatic systems. And they reproduce by producing fractal versions of themselves inside the cells that are then released. So they produce these mini nets. It's just wild how they coordinate the cell division. Anyways, I just wanted you to know that they exist. We're not going to talk about them. Okay, what about Chlorophyceae that look more truly multicellular? Well, there are some, and they can be really, really complex. They can look like plants because they have traits that are associated with plant life. They have rhizoids, so not true roots. These are kind of really simplistic structures that function as roots. They can have branched stems, and they can have plasmodesmata. Now that's kind of interesting because plasmodesmata are the connections between plant cells, right? Allows materials to go between them. They're essential for multicellularity. They're not essential for unicellularity. And this was a huge adaptation that facilitated the development of bigger bodies. So we start to see them in the Chlorophyceae. All right, so there's all these cues that the chlorophytes and the land plants are related. But I guess the question is, why bother with all this specialization, right? You have to produce all these different structures, rhizoids, stems, plasmodesmata. Why do you have to do it if you can solve it by just being unicellular? Well, not very many organisms stay completely unicellular. Clearly there's advantages of being multicellular, and it's to do with the ability to adapt to different conditions, the ability to form specialized structures that can evolve and respond to specific conditions. Single cells are kind of at the mercy of their environment. So Ovofaciae is the second group we're going to talk about. They're all multicellular, and they look very much like what you think seaweed looks like. They're sheets or filamentous. They have isomorphic alternation of generations, which means both the sporophyte and the gametophyte look exactly the same. And it's true alternation of generations. So very similar to plants, there's two multicellular phases of the life cycle. And let me show you a picture. There's oh, this isn't a good one. This is sporocmeiosis, as you recall. Here's a better picture from your textbook, right? The only difference between this life cycle and the Chlamydomonas life cycle is that there is mitosis here, and there is mitosis here. So you have, remember, Chlamydomonas was single cells becoming gametes, becoming individuals. If at these two spots, the zygote, instead of just becomes a spore, it actually undergoes mitosis, and there's specialization so that there can be sporangia where meiosis occurs, then we've got these multicellular organisms. And here, similarly, the gametophyte is multicellular, has specialized organs, gametangia. So it has, they're not male and female at this stage because this is an oogamy, but they have mating types, positive and negative mating types. So exactly the same as the life cycle I just showed you, except for there's been 2 incidences of mitosis. Okay, so I want to talk about sloths because who wouldn't want to talk about sloths? They just seem to be smiling in every picture I see of them. And anyhow, I get too caught up in sloths. But the thing I want to talk about today is their fur. As you can see, the little guy on the right has a distinct greenish tinge to his or her fur. And most of you probably know, if you know anything about sloths, that they grow algae on the fur. They actually, purposefully cultivate algae. Like, look at that guy, he's so happy. But people for a long time didn't really know why they did that. Is it camouflage? Because they can't move very fast and they live in the trees. Is it adaptive for self-defense? Do they get nutrients from the algae through their skin? Why are they doing it? Well, the algae that live in them they're specialized. They're unique to sloths. They only grow on sloths, and they're Ovofaciae. So that's why we're talking about them right now. So can you imagine a lineage of algae that just adapted to live on sloths? The world is kind of crazy. So a paper came out a couple of years ago and they sequenced some sloth fur and they found an entire ecosystem, right? They found Chlorophyta, Ascomycota fungi, Basidiomycota, that's like a mushroom, arthropods, chordates, I should look that up, I don't know what that one is, Euglena, rhodophytes, amoebozoa, cercozoa, apicomplexa, dinophyceae, ciliophora, and what's important for us today is, where is the Chlorophyta? Yeah, they found a specific one that only occurs in sloth fur. So what they think now, here's the ecosystem. The algae grows in the fur. The sloth eats some of the algae, but not very much. A moth comes and lays its eggs on the fur. The green algae is fertilized by the moth feces and helps it improve its growth. So weird little ecosystem. Okay, so moths increase the amount of nitrogen in the sloth's fur, which encourages the algae to thrive, and the sloths are thought to eat the algae to supplement their limited diet because they only eat leaves. Okay, last one. So we've done Chlorophyceae, Ovofaciae, and then we're doing Charophyceae. These ones are thought to be the most closely related to land plants. They shared the most recent ancestor, and they look very plant-like. But they can still be unicellular, colonial, or multicellular. It's not just their cellularity, they have other traits that are very similar to plants. So how? They've got the specialization. What kind of specialization? Well, they've got cellulose walls, cell walls, which is only found in plants. We haven't seen that yet. And they have structures that really look like leaves, branches, and roots, but they're not, they're still not true leaves, branches, and roots, but they function like them. They're parenchymatous, which means they have storage tissue in their body. And we haven't seen that yet. We saw a storage area, the purinoid, right, where the organism, the Chlamydomonas, stored starch, but this is actually a storage organ, parenchyma. So this is new, right? This is very advantageous for organisms because when times are good, they can store up energy. So Cariophyacea, they're also called stoneworts. They have cell division and reproduction similar to land plants. And that's why I don't want to talk about it today. I want to contrast these with bryophytes next week and show you in more detail. Oh, Spirogyra, this is like Volvox, just such a cool little organism. Helical arrangements of chloroplasts. But yeah, really simple reproduction. Like, look at this, the filaments, they're multicellular. Even though they're multicellular, it doesn't mean they have to specialize, because in Spirogyra, the entire cellular content becomes a gamete and they are fertilized by conjugation. Their little bridge forms between two adjacent filaments, and there's just transfer of cell contents. So multicellularity is often associated with specialization, but sometimes I guess they don't need it. Wherever these guys live, it didn't matter. They didn't need to develop gametangia. And we'll talk about that, why that might be next week. Okay, little cuties having sex, blah, blah, blah. Okay, last thing I want to show you are the desmids. This is another group in the Cariophyacea. They're all unicellular. They live in freshwater. They're the most abundant in this group, and they are the coolest organisms ever. And I didn't know anything about them until I started teaching this class, but I just want to leave you with some pictures. They are like, these ones are reproductive, are just post-reproductive, right? They conjugate. They are spectacular. Anyways, I should have showed you more pictures, but look up desmids if you're interested. They're so beautiful. Corallis are stoneworts. You've probably heard of them. They make up a large amount of the limestone. They kind of work like plants. They have apical growth. They have nodes and internodes where the branches come off. The branches are in whorls like many plants. But they're still really simple. Like, their stem cells are just giant single cells. So they're just barely differentiated. But it's an intermediate between the other algae and plants for sure, because they have complex gametangia. They have antheridia and oogonia, and only the sperms are flagellate, so they have oogamy, like the plants. And here's an example. You can see the antheridia are the little blops on the sporophyte, and the oogonium. And here's one. Here's an oogonium, and here's an antheridium right beside each other. Okay. Questions. What would be good questions for your final? Which groups have primary plastids? Name them and describe their general growth and habits. So all the groups we've talked about. Who was the most likely ancestor of land plants? Explain. We're going to get more into that next week, so you can flesh out your answer once we've done that. And why become multicellular? What are some advantages and disadvantages? When would it not pay to be multicellular? Why would it not pay to be multicellular? All right. Thanks, guys. I will see you soon.